I'm Dr. Keith Bramwell with Jamesway Incubator Company, and welcome to our Wednesday webinar series. It's been a very good series since we started several years ago. A lot of people, as I said, a lot of people registered for this one. I guess they see the value in this topic, which there's a lot of value in this topic. Just some housekeeping. If you want to hear the presentation in Spanish, there's a button at the bottom of the screen, interpretation button. Click that, and then you'll hear a simultaneous translation of this presentation in Spanish. Our speaker today is Victoria Collette from Avigen. She started with Hubbard Farms actually in 2016, and then moved into Avigen as that acquisition occurred. She's an incubation specialist, spends a lot of time out in the field in hatcheries directly, so she's not just telling you what's supposed to be done. It's what she's seen in practice as well. And she's graduated from Tennessee Tech, and I'm glad to have her here. Mauricio, if you want to kind of direct people as well, do a brief Spanish introduction and direct people to the interpretation.
Of course, sir. Bueno, buenos días a todos nuevamente. Repitiendo las palabras que dijo el doctor Keith Bramwell, bienvenidos a nuestro webinar de los miércoles. Como siempre, a todas las personas que vayan ingresando y que estén interesados en escuchar la charla en español, recuerden que en la parte inferior de sus pantallas van a ver un pequeño mundo que es Interpretation. En este pequeño mundo puedes poner directamente a español y aquí vas a escuchar una traducción simultánea. Y como siempre, la parte de preguntas va a ser al final, lo van a ver en el botón de Q y A. Y nada, pues bienvenidos a esta interesante charla con la expositora Victoria Collette, que pertenece a Aviagen desde el 2016 y es una especialista en incubación. Bienvenidos. All set, sir.
Thank you, Mauricio. Again, so our topic today, or speaker today, Victoria Collette from Avian. She's an incubation specialist, and she's going to be talking about the title of her presentation, Timing is Everything When Optimizing Hatch Outcomes, and I cannot agree with that more. And so I'm really glad to have Victoria on here and bringing her experience in this area and in this field, and letting you all know what she's seen and found and how to help you all have better hatcheries. So with that, I'll turn the time over to you, Victoria, and if you'd share your screen and we can get rolling.
All right, thank you. Let's minimize this. There we go. All right. Yes, so as you said, my name is Victoria Collett. I am an incubation specialist working with Avigen. We are talking about hatch timing today. So to get good quality chicks, we need to organize our hatch timing so we have proper takeoff or pool time in regards to our hatch window and ideal chick yield for the breed that we're hatching. So there's many things that go into having good quality chicks, but these are the 4 that we're going to talk about today. The hatch window is a major ticket when discussing hatch timing, so we'll constantly go back to the hatch window. However, there are other places that hatcheries make mistakes that I did want to include in today's talk, starting with genetics. So different breeds have varying characteristics. So with different breeds available in the industry, there are numerous crosses and therefore numerous requirements needing to be met. For example, different breeds might have different yolk, albumin, and shell ratios to each other. For example, you may have 2 eggs, the exact same size, and it's easier to explain in flock age because this can be seen everywhere. So the same size from a 28-week-old flock and a 35-week-old flock. And the 28-week-old flock's eggs will have a much smaller yolk and therefore a smaller embryo compared to the 35-week-old. So the smaller embryos will produce less heat for their batch of eggs. And the same concept applies when discussing breed characteristics. So you may have higher yielding crosses, and they produce larger eggs with larger yolks and larger embryos, and these large embryos produce more heat. So they may actually need a cooler profile being ran compared to other crosses with either smaller eggs or smaller yolks in comparison to the egg size. So fortunately, most hatcheries only deal with 1 or 2 crosses, but knowing the needs of the breeds that you're hatching will help determine your incubation requirements, such as total incubation time. This is a graph of a trial that we ran a few years ago, and it compares the 708 with a 308 with a 308 AP in regards to hatch time. And you can see how the higher yielding cross, such as the 708 YPM, where it has an increased growth rate in the field and they grow really fast, really big, really fast. They are also slightly ahead in embryo development. So not only do they grow fast at the farm, they also grow fast in the hatchers. So they're slightly ahead and they actually hatch out sooner compared to the 308 or the 308 AP. Now, one thing that's very interesting about the 308 AP is that it actually tends to have a tighter hatch window. So they may start off hatching later, but they catch up really nicely to the 308. And that tighter hatch window produces very uniform, good quality chicks. The main thing to know here is that different crosses will have different total incubation times. Now, this was a trial, so we kept all of the incubation temperatures and settings as great as we could throughout incubation until we got to the hatcher. And you can see all the points on the graph. We did open up the incubator, the hatcher, every 6 hours to count every individual chick, and this took a lot of time. So because it took a lot of time, every time we opened the door and ruined our hatcher environment because we let all the humidity out, we let all the CO2 out, it ruined our hatch window. It's the observer effect. Every time you go in and look at it, it changes. So we widen the hatch window. So these times may not be the times you have in your hatcher based on management practices, based on hatchery location, based on the different type of machines that you have as well. Now, if you incubate different breeds, ideally they're placed in separate machines, mainly because they do hatch at different times. However, I know that's not always possible logistically. Sometimes we do have to set eggs of different strains in one machine. And if you have to do that, ideally you set the eggs earlier or later according to the cross that you have and the time that it means. So here's another example of a trial that we did. Same concept. We went in every couple hours and counted. So it really shows how you may need to set eggs an hour or up to 6 hours earlier for other strains compared to the 708 and the 308. So the reason you want to set the eggs earlier instead of holding the chicks longer is because you really want them to hatch together. So if they hatch separately, for example, the 708 and the 308, the 708 chicks will end up pipping earlier and they release the CO2 and the humidity, which we'll get to. But the 708s will be, I mean, they're 50% hatching while this 308 is just starting their really rapid increase of hatching. And because of that, by the time the 708s are done hatching and the 308s are still hatching, the 708s would need temperature decrease and they'll need more ventilation because all the chicks are out, whereas the 308s aren't hardly ready. But if you set the eggs earlier and we move this blue line to the red line and they hatch together, then you can open up your ventilation, you can decrease your temperature all at the same time, and you don't sacrifice poor quality 708s for a better hatch of the 308s, because if you accommodate the 708s, you tend to end up chilling and cooling the 308s early. And if you accommodate the 308s, you could overheat your 708s and you'll end up with poor quality chicks. So if we can move those eggs, set those eggs earlier and move the hatch line to be equal, then we don't have to sacrifice either of those. One thing we hear often is that the 308 doesn't, where it is behind, a lot of hatchery managers will try to increase the incubation temperature to accommodate logistics and daily routines and try to get the chicks out sooner. And you really don't want to do that. Reasons not to increase the temperature is because high temperatures will affect organ development and decrease your hatch. High eggshell temperatures often results in decreased chick weight, higher residual yolk weight, decreased organs. It hurts the immune system for disease protection because you end up with a smaller bursa. And you end up with poorly closed navels as well, because that decreased chick weight, those smaller chicks with that high residual yolk, it can't, when it's absorbing it into the chick, it can't fully close. So you end up with a little bit of the yolk out and that black button that we see sometimes, which is not ideal. So maintaining optimal temperature is crucial. Slight deviations can affect your embryonic development and hatch timing. Now, if you take eggshell temperatures and they're below 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 37.8 Celsius, then yes, you may want to increase your temperature. So I'm not saying that the solution's never to increase the temperature, but Typically, it's just needing additional time in the hatchers. Increasing the temperature is not a solution to speed up the hatching process. A couple other genetic hatch variations. So different genetic lines may have variations in the rate of embryonic development, affecting the time it takes for eggs to hatch. One example is layers versus broilers. If you ever try to run a layer, try to hatch layer lines on a broiler profile, you learn very quickly that that hard eggshell makes it quite tough for them to lose moisture. So you end up with a lot of half-hatch chicks. They also need more time. So we end up with this oftentimes. Another change is mini broiler lines, or another difference is mini broiler lines are selectively bred for that faster growth and improved feed conversion, which we talked about, which can indirectly influence your hatching time through overall embryo vigor. So the more we cross them down to the parent stock level, and then you cross them for broilers, you end up with a lot of variations. So for example, the 708 versus the 308, they just hatch at different times. There are just genetic differences between those strains. So some breeds have better thermoregulatory capabilities or energy reserves, allowing them to complete the hatching process more effectively, more efficiently. There are other genetic traits that can influence the quality of the egg, including shell thickness, albumin quality, yolk composition, all of which can impact the incubation process and timing. And then the genetic traits of the hen can also affect factors such as the egg size and overall egg quality, shell quality, which all significantly impact the hatch timing. Poor quality eggs may hatch later or may not hatch at all, depending on how poor quality they are. And there are many factors affecting the hatch window when comparing different crosses. And ideally, each cross is in its own incubator and its own hatcher, but sometimes we do have to set them together. In that case, you do set the profile to the majority and you balance your machines the best you can. Moving on to the hatch window. So the first question is, what is the hatch window? So a critical aspect of managing your hatch process is determining the hatch window. And the hatch window is the time elapsed from the very first chick to the last chick emerging. Now, a hatch window of about 24 to 26 hours is seen as optimal and achievable in broiler hatcheries and single-stage hatcheries. Although multi-stage or higher generations, they do tend to take a little bit longer. Up to 30 hours is acceptable to still get good quality chicks. If you're over 30 hours, we might need to reevaluate your hatcher profiles and conditions. So it is important to know your hatch time and to manage your hatch window to optimize your hatchability and chick quality. Now you can see in the diagram here that the hatch window looks like it ends right after the humidity peak. Now you'll still have a couple chicks hatch out after, but for determining hatcher needs, this is the area that you really want to focus on. This is the point where if you mess up the hatcher needs during this phase, then you could really decrease your hatch and chick quality. So the first point here is the first chick out. And during incubation, chicks produce carbon dioxide, they bring in oxygen, and that carbon dioxide production by the embryo increases throughout incubation. And the pores on the eggshell will help with gas exchange. However, towards the end of incubation, the shell is not actually porous enough to allow complete gas exchange. So a surplus of CO2 is stored up in the air cell, especially after internal pipping. Pips into that air cell, it's breathing in a little bit more compared to before when it's using the can. So once the embryo pips through the eggshell, there's a marked increase of CO2 rising. So that's your carbon dioxide coming up there in the purple. And because all of that stored CO2 that was stored in the egg, it's released once that chick pips through the eggshell. Also, when the chick breaks through the shell, it is still coated in fluid, which causes a rapid rise in humidity as the bulk of the chicks pip and hatch out. So that's point 2 here. You can see the CO2 and humidity increasing. And once the majority of your embryos are hatched out and the chicks dry off, humidity starts to fall again, and that's where we have point 3. So by checking the time elapsed between point 1 and point 3, we can estimate the natural hatch window. And like Dr. Bramwell said, I'd really like to use real life examples because it's what you see in the field compared to a graph that we can make on a computer. So in the past, hatch window has been determined by opening the hatcher at intervals and counting the chicks in sample trays. Now we still do this for trials, but it's not ideal because unfortunately opening their hatchery doors for one or even repeated count risks disturbing the hatchery environment and altering your hatch window in the process. Every time you open those doors, you release humidity, it drops, your carbon dioxide drops, and if you're running a disinfectant such as formaldehyde, all of that escapes out through the door as well. So if a less intrusive approach is to monitor humidity and carbon dioxide trends through the hatch using parameters already reported by your hatchers in your hatch computer. So if you're looking at your hatcher graphs on the computer, you should be able to see, for example, the humidity line in this one is green and the CO2 rising down here is in pink. It's kind of thin, but you can see it. So depending on how you have your damper settings, you may also see the damper here in this yellow-orange, and you can see it opening more than the minimum set. And it depends on if you have it set on CO2 or humidity. I think this example was humidity. So at embryo stage, I like to run it off CO2, the damper for ventilation. At embryo stage, I think Jamesway recommends no more than 8,000 parts per million. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's right. And then at chick stage, once the chicks are out, no more than 5,000 parts per million or 0.5%. So reviewing your computer has advantages over the traditional open and doors count system. So by only looking at your computer, you avoid disturbances in the hatchery environment, and the humidity curve provides an accurate representation of that true hatch window, enabling hatchery workers to plan subsequent procedures effectively. Now, over time, you can compare outcomes by different breeds and crosses, different flocks, different egg ages, as well as by machine and machine hallway. And it's quite easy to see if you have an issue in one of your machines or your machine hallway, but you have to make sure that all of your variables are out. One hatchery I went to was multi-stage, and all of their hatchers and setters were very even on hatch percentage, except one. So I automatically thought something was wrong with this one machine. Turns out they put all of their second-class eggs, second-grade eggs in one machine, and those poor quality eggs just don't hatch as well as good quality hatching eggs. So there wasn't actually anything wrong with that machine. It was something that we were doing on purpose, and it was fine, as long as you know what variables you're adding in place. Another hatchery, they have 3 hallways, A, B, and C, and they would hatch all of their youngest flocks in hallway A, all of their prime flocks in hallway B, and then all of their older flocks in hallway C. And there was nothing better about hallway B than there was hallway C, but it definitely looked like that when looking at the trends. So making sure you know what you're setting in each machine helps you make informed decisions based on trends and patterns accurately. Now, if everything is across the board even, you could still have differences, and that's when you look into where is your chiller, where is your air compressor? Is your air compressor further away from hallway C and not having enough air pressure to turn all of those machines by the time it gets all the way to that hallway? Is your chiller water too far away from hallway A, and is it hurting those? Is it not getting the cold water there fast enough? Is it not cold enough by the time it gets to hallway A? So if everything's even across the board, it definitely makes looking at machine hallways a little bit easier. But having historical data describing humidity curves available allows the hatchery manager or incubationist to make informed decisions based on trends and patterns, leading to an improved hatching outcomes over time. So monitoring your humidity curve during incubation period provides a non-intrusive and data-driven approach to determining your hatch window. On another note, depending on how you have your damper, you could also be doing the chicks a disservice. So for example, in this hatcher, humidity is red and the damper here is in blue. As soon as the chicks start hatching and that humidity starts increasing, this hatchery was already opening the damper quite a bit, and it quickly got to 100%, but the chicks weren't even finished hatching yet, so it really messed with the humidity curve, it messed with the CO2 in the machine, and they ended up with poor quality chicks. You don't want to ventilate as much, you don't want 100% ventilation until the chicks are out. And another example, if you don't see the humidity curve at all, you may be overventilating too soon. Now, In this one, you can see that we are ventilating some, but we still have that nice curve beforehand. So you need to ventilate, but delay that 100% ventilation and let that humidity build until after the peak of hatch. Some other factors affecting your hatch window. Factors affecting the hatch window actually began on the farm. So we already briefly talked about flock age playing a role in egg composition for younger flocks, but for older flocks as well. So older flocks tend to have less fertility, which means they have less heat output for their batch of eggs, and less embryos, less heat ends up slowing down your hatch. So especially for single stage, or if all of your older flocks are in the same machine for multi-stage. Now, one thing you can do is you can candle around day 10 or 12 and backfill your trays to maintain heat production. Now, if you choose this method, you want to remember to plan ahead as to where your empty trays are going to be, because if you end up messing your airflow up incorrectly, you're going to do a much more damage than if you didn't candle at all. Also, if you have different machines, so if you have 3 or 4 machines to candle, you might be able to condense down to 2. And you'll end up saving some machine space and utilization if you have, depending on your fertility. But you want to make sure whatever you do is you maintain that ideal embryonic heat with airflow and machine utilization rate. So now there will be variations in egg size as well. Mainly from setting different flocks in the same incubators, but also some variation from the same flock. Oftentimes, larger eggs produce larger embryos, which end up taking longer to hatch. Now, the smaller eggs and the younger flocks, which produce less embryonic heat, alone would take longer to hatch if they were set at the same profile. The larger eggs and the larger eggs are going to maintain heat better compared to the smaller eggs. Now, if you mix them up, small eggs and large eggs all at the same temperature, the small eggs don't take as long to hatch out, which sounds confusing, but you end up having, if you have a lot of variation of egg size in your machine, you end up having a wider hatch window. So very consistent egg size is important on making sure that your hatch window is as tight as possible. Now, for egg age and egg storage, you also want all of those conditions because they're very important for your hatch window. We need to make sure egg collection is frequent and eggs are cooled down evenly. So the longer the eggs stay in the house, the more the embryo will grow. So if egg collection is infrequent or cooling down isn't even, we end up with embryos of different sizes. And the embryos will be at different stages of development at the time of set, which will widen your hatch window. Some causes of eggs cooling unevenly are placing eggs on fiber flats and stacking in boxes before completely cooling, or uneven temperatures in your egg storage rooms. Another reason that eggs could have this embryo development differences is by if you're putting on racks and you start at the top instead of the bottom. So warm air rises, heat rises. So as warmer eggs are placed on the bottom, they end up warming the cool eggs above them, again, resulting in embryos at different stages of development and widening your hatch window. Now, setter and hatcher loading is also very important for airflow throughout the machines. Air is quite lazy and will shortcut when it can. Some hatcheries start with rack 1, tray 1, and fill it up until they run out. However, if your machine is not full, all of that empty space ends up in one spot, and instead of being evenly spaced out. So this is a good example. This hatchery started on the right side here, and they filled up, and then they started on the left side until they ran out of eggs, and they ended up leaving 10 empty trays, which is right next to the fan. So as the air flows, it'll go up and come down through all of those empty baskets. And as it's coming back to the ECU and it's going up and around, it's shortcutting these eggs down here and creating hot spots in the machine. So this will create very uneven temperatures and the airflow, so it will end up creating a very uneven hatch window. Now, if they would have turned the buggy around or switched sides, it would have been better. As you can see in the Jamesway manual example, if you have the empties, you want them next to the wall, because as it comes up, if there's eggs here, to get back to the ECU, it has to go through those eggs instead of shortcutting around them. I always learned this a while back. Always refer to your manual. So even for multi-stage or different machine types, all of the manuals have in how to set a partial set for better balancing. So you also want to be aware of your machine utilization rate. So the less eggs you have in a machine, the less heat output from those eggs, especially in single stage. You might need to adjust the profile for ventilation and temperature to maintain ideal egg temperatures with less amount of eggs. Now, ideally, you don't set 4 full machines and 1 partial machine that has 1 rack in it. You want to even those out, and your manuals will help you on how to set those eggs and how many eggs is a minimum per machine. So what else affects hatch window? Basically everything, but for today, the temperature. Hot and cold spots in the machine will create uneven embryonic development. So too cold of temperatures will slow down the hatch. Too hot of temperatures will speed up the hatch and damage chick quality. Proper humidity is essential for moisture loss from the eggs, so too high or too low can impact chick viability and timing. Humidity levels must be carefully monitored to prevent dehydration or excess moisture, which can hinder hatchability. And then your ventilation. So if your CO2 or humidity set points, if your ventilation set on those two, are too low, then it's very easily met, and hatcheries will end up being overventilated as it's quite easily achievable to hit those low levels. It'll cause uneven temperatures inside, lower disinfectant concentrations if you're using formaldehyde or anything else. And then if CO2 or humidity set points are too high, hatcheries will be underventilated because it's not going to ever reach those levels, and your chicks will suffer. For another example, so if there's high air pressure, can actually shoot through the machine instead of doing proper flow. So if the air is coming in and you have really high entry, like air pressure in front of the machine coming through, and if you have a negative pressure on the outside, instead of coming in, circulating, and then going out the exhaust, it'll actually, if it's overpressured, it'll go straight through and straight out. So you end up with hot spots in your machine because it's not properly ventilating. Now, if it's too low, you end up having the air not circulating quite as well either. You have very poor air quality, and your carbon dioxide can build up. So maintenance. So having a good preventative maintenance program is key to having a good hatchery. Making sure your gaskets, your seals, your fans, curtains, your turning, spray nozzles are all in proper working order will help you have a good hatch. You want to make sure your racks and fans are in place. I've seen some hatcheries, their fan is slightly to the side, so it's actually blowing only on the right side of the hatcher compared to the left. So they had a lot of hot spots on the left side. It wasn't the air wasn't circulating like it needed to be. And then you want to make sure your fan rotation is right. I've been in hatcheries where instead of the fans blowing up or the fans blowing down, they're blowing the opposite direction of what they should be blowing. So making sure the fan's not only running, but is turning the correct way as well. Consistency in these practices is essential to ensure uniform development. By carefully managing these factors, hatcheries can improve your hatchability and ensure that broiler chicks hatch and are pooled at the right time. If any number of these things aren't right, you can end up with poor quality chicks, whether they're dehydrated or if they're actually too early, green, weak chicks. Often you end up with unhealed navels, a variation in chick size, and unfortunately a higher 7-day mortality. Moving on to pull or takeoff time. Pull time, I think, is what most people use in the US, but then takeoff time seems to be everywhere else. Regardless, it's when you take the chicks out of the hatchers to begin processing them. So a long time ago, someone did a slight disservice to the poultry industry by using the standard deviation to show chicks hatching. And yes, I like standard deviation. It makes a nice graph to show a normal hatch distribution. And if you're using it to compare hatches, or if you're wanting to try the hatch sense, which actually moves this graph, so the majority of the chicks hatch toward the end of your hatch window, it's a very nice diagram to see and to see how it works. However, it looks an awful lot like the humidity peak you see on the hatch computer. So sometimes people get these confused. The peak of hatch does not equal the humidity peak. You can see that 68% of your hatch is going to come out in this dark blue area here, roughly 12 hours or so, 10, 12 hours. And it looks like at the top of the peak, 50% are out but it is, 50% are out here, which means you have 50% of your chicks left to hatch. But if you're comparing here, most of your chicks should be out here. You don't have 50% left to hatch after your humidity curve. So the top of the humidity curve is your bulk of hatch, not your peak of hatch. So you have to remember that the peak of hatch does not equal peak of humidity. I like to show the hatch window like this, even though it's kind of harder to picture. This is an example of another one of those hatch time trials that we were doing where we go in every 6 hours and we count. I think this was a 308 broiler. So you want no more than 1 to 2% out, roughly 30 hours before you're prior to pull. And this is 100% of the chicks that came out. This isn't 100% hatch of fertile. This isn't 100% hatchability, but this is 100% of the chicks that come out. So no more than 1%, usually no more than 1 per tray out 30 hours prior to pull. Now your peak of hatch, that 68% that we talked about, has a nice, it's where the slope increases the most. So that's where the majority of your chicks are hatching. Now I have 84% will hatch by 12 hours prior to pull. I believe Jamesway recommends no more than 60%, which is great, and especially if you're using the hatch sense or if you have a really tight hatch window. That is the goal, is to have a very tight hatch window. This example is a 30-hour hatch window, which is common to see. So if you have a 24-hour hatch window and you produce more uniform chicks, you probably only will have 60% out 12 hours prior to pull. But this is more common to see in the industry. So this is what I use. And as the hatch continues to increase at that high rate, that's where your humidity curve comes in. The more chicks that hatch out, the higher humidity will be, and the more the humidity curve will continue to increase. And as humid as it is in the hatchers, it's hard for those chicks to dry off in that humid environment. So the more moisture there is, the higher the humidity curve goes. And as the rate of chicks emerging begins to slow down, that's when the rate of chicks emerging slows down enough where the chicks start drying off more. So your humidity curve stops increasing and will actually start decreasing. And that's your peak of humidity. And that's when the bulk of your chicks are already out and is near the end of your hatch. Now I'm showing this graph again because looking at the hatch window can help you determine your pull time. So we discussed how to read the computer, and you can see the rise in humidity and the damper opening and the carbon dioxide. Once your hatch is over, the question becomes, when do you pull your chicks out? And a lot of people say 12 hours after the peak of hatch, 6 hours after the bulk of hatch. And it really depends on what you're calling peak and bulk of hatch. Now, I think this hatchery was waiting 12 hours after the peak of humidity, which is the bulk of hatch. And it seems quite long looking at the graph. And as long as your chicks are comfortable, you can actually leave them in the hatchers a little longer without any issues. So comfortable chicks will lose about a gram every 12 hours. But hot chicks will end up opening their mouth and they start panting, causing them to lose more moisture, dehydrate, and lose weight. So making sure that your chicks are comfortable, regardless of how long they're in the hatchers after hatching, is very important. So you're saying I should pull 6 hours after the bulk of hatch. That's a great place to start. But the question becomes, are your chicks ready? So if chicks are held in uncomfortable conditions in the hatcher too long, they won't grow as well in the broiler house, and the risk of dehydration increases, and with it, the risk of mortality in the first week. So we have multiple ways to check to see if your takeoff time is correct. The first one is by looking at your hatcher baskets, and you can see if the back of their neck is still wet. You want roughly 5% to still have a damp neck. If you have a lot of them, you end up with a lot of green or early chicks with these sleepy eyes that aren't ready to eat or drink, and they won't perform well on the farm. When chicks are pulled too early, too many chicks will be classified as second class because they're not completely dry yet. The eggs need to be set earlier, and you'll hear me say set eggs earlier instead of pulling later, as most of the time the hatchery wants to pull at the exact time every single day. So it's easier logistically to add more time, more total incubation time at the beginning compared to the end. Now, I don't love how most hatcheries say chicks are pulled at 6 a.m. every morning, but I do understand it from a business point of view. Day-old chicks shouldn't be pulled on the clock. but rather when the chicks are visually ready for takeoff. So regularly monitoring this can help us determine the exact time we need so you can be closer to your time logistically with every hatch. You can also look at the wing feathers, the primaries and the coverts. Now, I'm not sexing chickens today, but you do want them to be the sharp pin feathers you see on the right. If you see the feather blades open, they're on the left. The chicks have been in the hatcher too long. You don't want to see the feather blades open coming out of the hatcher. Another way to check if your pool time is correct is to check the soil level on your eggs that are left in the baskets. So you want to pick your 5 dirtiest eggs from your hatcher baskets and compare this to the 5-point scale shown. Now, if your dirtiest eggs are in group 4 or 5, then you may want to set your eggs 3 hours later and check the flock again at the next hatch. The longer that you leave them in there, the more of a risk for dehydration occurs. All of the chicks will be dry and fluffy at that time, but you do risk dehydration if you leave them in too long. If the eggs are clean and spotless, you want to check your hatch debris for live embryos, as your total incubation time might be too short. And this would be indicated by wet chicks in the hatcher baskets, a lot of live pipped eggs in your hatch debris. So you may want to set your eggs 3 hours earlier and check it again. Moving on to chick yield. Ultimately, hatch timing has a direct impact on chick yield. So chick yield is the percentage of the chick weight at hatch compared to the fresh egg weight at set. So the process of hatching is a drastic physiological change over for the embryo. Internal pipping involves the transition from the chorioallantoic, the exchange of nutrients and gases within the egg, to lung respiration. And during external pipping, the chick works very hard to break that eggshell. This process is exhausting for the chicks. So before takeoff, they need to spend some time in the hatcher to rest and dry out. It is critical for day-old chicks' livability and performance after placement that the hatcher conditions are correct for the final stage and that they're at the right maturity level when they are pulled from the hatchers to be processed. Measuring chick yield will help you determine the chick maturity at takeoff. It's a fairly easy formula. So you divide your average chick weight by the average fresh egg weight, but you do want to make sure your scales are calibrated and to subtract for the tray and the box weights. Trays and boxes, and even in one hatchery, they usually differ a lot. So I would take the tray weight and box weight each time to make sure your data is accurate. Now, the best way to view your chick yield and moisture loss data is to make a scatter plot. Most hatcheries already calculate evaporation rate at transfer, so you can plot them against each other to see where your chicks fall. Above the target box indicates a high chick yield, suggesting that chicks are being pulled too early. Now, this data set plotted here suggests that the chicks are pulled too early more often than they are pulled late. And then below the target box indicates a low chick yield, possibly due to leaving chicks in the hatcher for too long after they emerge. Values below 65% are associated with very poor broiler performance, so we really want to make sure we get them out before they get down to 65%. Then left to the target box points to the level. Points to the left indicate low moisture loss, which could be due to high humidity or insufficient airflow within the setter. And then points to the right suggest high moisture loss due to either low humidity or excessive ventilation in the setter. So we aim for that green box for ideal conditions, creating very uniform chicks at hatch. Chick yield is not only driven by humidity and moisture loss, but also just by elapsed time in the incubator. So it's important to remember this when considering the optimal chick yield for your operation, because chick yield doesn't only indicate hydration status, but also maturity. When chasing chick quality, both are important, and it's counterproductive to chase high levels of hydration by sacrificing maturity. Day-old chicks with the right maturity status at takeoff will have a chick yield between 67–68%, while chicks with the right maturity at takeoff will have enough time resting after they've hatched out, so they'll be active and ready to eat when they're placed on the farm. Chicks that are pulled too early will have a chick yield over 69%, and they'll have relatively poorly healed navels, and they are actually more susceptible to handling and impact damage. To reduce chick yield by 1%, the chicks need an average of 3 to 5 hours longer in the incubator, where chicks that have a yield below 66% are held in the hatchers too long, and they risk being dehydrated. So to reduce dehydration, try to pull the chicks at the most ideal time and take care of the hatchery temperatures, that they're kept under tight control once the chicks are out. You really want to be aiming for vent temperatures between 103 and 105. I say vent temperatures. I know some people still take rectal temperatures. From an animal welfare point of view, I like the vent temperatures. But if you are taking rectal temperatures, it's probably closer to 104, 105 degrees is where you're aiming to keep those chicks. Now, assuming your incubation time is right, your chick yields could still be off based on chicks being incubated at low temperatures or high humidity. They will tend to look green or weak, wet, green chicks at takeoff, because both will experience that delayed development. Conversely, eggs incubated in high temperatures or low humidity will become dehydrated in the hatchers. Also, unbalanced machines with hot and cold spots can make your hatch spread very wide by affecting developmental speeds. So this is an example of a hatchery that had very, very wide cold spots. Obviously not what you want to see when you see your hatcher baskets. There is more information on chick yield at avigen.com. You can read our how to measure chick yield or our hatchery tip. Both have a lot of information on how to take it, and then the reason why and how it can help you determine your hatch timing. So in conclusion, we've discussed a lot. So knowing your breed or your cross characteristics for hatching, especially incubation time. You don't want to increase temperature just to speed up your hatch. You want to measure eggshell temperatures on a regular basis so you know where you stand, whether you do need to increase the temperature or bring it down a little bit. Shortening your hatch window starts at the farm by taking care of your eggs. Your hatch window should be between 24 and 26 hours. That's our target, but it can be up to 30 hours with little to no issues. Flock age, young flocks, and then really old flocks, you may need to set 2 hours earlier to get that proper hatch time. Egg age, anything over 7 days, you may need to add time. You'll want to balance your sets in a way heat will be distributed evenly and airflow will not be disturbed. Temperature, humidity, ventilation, and maintenance are probably the most important things when trying to control your hatch window. Your peak of hatch does not equal your humidity peak. You do want to measure chick yield and you're aiming for that 67, 68%. Now, if you have a long drive between the hatchery and the farm, you may aim for 69%. You do want to check to make sure that no more than 5% of your chicks have a damp neck when they're coming out of the hatchers. You want to make sure that none of your chicks have the feather blades out when they're coming out of the hatchers. And then you can also review your meconium score to make sure your hatch timing is correct as well. And that is all I have.
Thank you.
Figure out. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed a lot of good information there. As a matter of fact, I'm sending it to a lot of our group, so good information. In relation to what you were talking about in there, so you're at the end, you were talking about yield, chick yield, and egg moisture loss. I mean, how do those two really? I mean, you have the graph there, but how do they really correlate? Like, if you're going to see high yield, too high yields, not good, good. How does that relate to moisture loss?
Yes. So, and because they both deal with the moisture loss and evaporation rates of how much moisture you're losing in the machine, but the ones that you take at transfer are more on humidity and ventilation versus chick yield is also more on timing, but they both relate to humidity. So if you have most of the time on the graph, you see it more like that. Sorry, it's backwards in my camera. If you have lower evaporation rates, you tend to have higher yields versus if you have higher evaporation rates, you tend to have lower yields just because of how much moisture is being lost.
So if you're looking at data, say you're looking at some data from somebody else and they're, they don't collect moisture loss, but they're like, oh, we've got 70, 71, 72, 73% chick yield. The assumption can be made, okay, you've got a moisture loss issue as well, correct?
Yes, and that is the first thing people look at is moisture loss.
Okay.
And that's where you come in and you use your observations of what your chicks look like to determine if they need more time. So if you think your time is right, then you would need to adjust for moisture loss.
Okay. What is the general rule for delayed in pull time based on egg storage?
So if
70
you're
days compared to 10 days of storage or 14 days of storage, that type of thing.
So the first step is if you know you're going to store your eggs for a long time, you do want to decrease your egg room temperature. And some people, they'll decrease it over time. Ideally, if you know they're going to be stored for 2 weeks, you want to go ahead and drop it down. I've seen a lot of hatcheries, their egg cooler temperatures are 64 degrees, 67 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're keeping eggs long, you do want to drop it down closer to 60 degrees. Even longer depending on your storage. But then you do want to make sure that you're careful to bring them back up because you'll create a lot of condensation, which could introduce bacteria to your eggs. But then, so if it's over 7 days, you want to add an hour. If it's closer to 2 weeks, over 10 days, 14 days, you want to add 2 to 3 hours. So the longer you store them, you may want to add a couple extra hours.
And then, like you said in your presentation, add the hours in the incubation time by changing your set time, not by, oh, we've got to crank up the profile.
Yes.
Temperature profile, just your set time down.
Yes, and a lot of people are like, oh, I'll just leave them in the hatcher long. Well, you've already ventilated and you've already dropped your temperature down. Extra time at the very end is not as helpful as it would be from the beginning.
And like you said, most people have a time they want to pull. They
Yes,
have flexibility of when they set often, not everybody, I found, but they have more flexibility there than the pull time usually.
usually, yes.
Is there a rule of thumb like for egg age as far as from older or younger breeders?
There might be. I haven't looked into it. I know the younger flocks, they also need more time. So I'm sure the younger the flock is, plus the longer egg storage, you may need to add another 4 to 5 hours. And then same thing for older flocks, because you all automatically want to add time for older flocks and for storage. So you may need to add a couple extra hours for both.
Okay. So in terms of our incubation, we know the eggs containing the embryos become exothermic, in that last week. So in your opinion, with the multi-stage machines that you've seen and worked with, are those machines able to cool those properly down with that heat load in that last week?
Yes, the hatchery that I mentioned, that puts all of their prime flocks in one hallway, that tends to have worse. A lot of times it can't keep up doing that because most of the machines, I think it's set as a 20-60-20 ratio of 20% young flocks, 60% prime, and 20% old because of that. But if you put all of your high density, high fertility flocks together, sometimes you can have issues with that rack 6 overheating.
Okay. What is a lot of places, not everybody, but a lot of places still use formalin. What are some problems you might see with that in relation if you have a big hatch window, so you got a lot of different age chicks and you're using formalin? Is there an area there we want to be careful the chicks being exposed to that?
Yes, so I recommend no more than like 20 parts per million on that, which that is up to your management practices on how much you want to use. You do want an accurate meter reader. But most people try to fumigate on the front end of hatch, not the back end, because if all your chicks are out and they're breathing in that formaldehyde or the formalin, it can cause damage to the trachea depending on the levels of formaldehyde in the machine.
Okay, so I think that's what they were asking is like, is there a time where they could start damaging the chicks? And you answered that.
Yes. And I have seen that it is not good. You will lose a lot of your hatch.
Yeah. What about preheating, say as far as relation to your incubation time? Your pre-warming. I mean, some people go
Yes.
elaborate with that. I mean, it used to be it's like, oh, we're just going to pre-warm, but we've got in our platinum machines, we can put them in there for 8, 12, 16, 18 hours if we want. What effect do you see that has on chick quality?
So in one single stage hatchery, I was concerned because they were putting in sets that they wanted to go in on Saturday. They were putting them in on Friday, and they were setting them for that longer preheat. and delayed preheat. And I was like, I don't know about this. You're taking them out of the egg cooler. They actually had a better hatch with that long preheat than the ones that were only getting 8 hours. But the hatch window, as long as the temperature is right on that, you don't want to heat them up too fast, too quickly. As long as the preheat is okay, you're not just jumping straight to 100 degrees, then you can actually end up having a pretty uniform hatch, a pretty tight hatch window because of it.
Yeah, cause a little bit more uniformity in that. Now, we don't really know, at least I don't really know exactly how that affects. So if you're doing 12 hours, before, and you got 8 hours at 80 degrees and maybe 2 hours at 85 or whatever, exactly how much that accelerates growth, because it does. There's some growth going on there. And I don't know whether you have a thought on that. There's some growth. We just have to account for that. Sometimes it's more trial and error, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, yeah, I'm not trained on embryo staging. I'd like to do it sometime because it's very fascinating to me. But we have seen differences in different crosses on what stage they come out of the hen versus how long it takes to get up to incubation temperature on where that development occurs. The slower preheat, the more uniform it does tend to be. But at the same time, most people, they're on, like you said, they're on a deadline. So they only have 8 hours allocated to it. They can't extend it to 12. They can't extend it to 16. Some hatcheries, they have a 4-hour preheat. As long as it's a very gradual preheat, it's usually pretty good.
If it's done correctly. There was a discussion many years ago. People don't preheat. Well, if you do it right, it's great. But
yes.
there was a lot of people doing it improperly, and so you got ununiform preheating, which is worse.
And that happens a lot in multi-stage because I've seen people, they'll put them just in the hallway and they're preheating them in the hallway, but the airflow's not right in a hallway to preheat eggs. So they still end up with differences in embryo development.
And it can be worse too, because if the airflow is not correct in there. What about improper turning? Do you think that would have an effect on your air movement, ventilation, and potentially moisture loss?
Yes.
Moisture loss of the eggs.
Oh, yes. And that is one thing people, I don't think, check enough is their turning. You can take a piece of paper and fold it at a 45-degree angle and figure out where you are. But they also make very fancy angle meters that you can check very quickly. You walk through your hatchery. Once a month should be enough to check to see if your turning angles are enough. But that's typically a problem in every hatchery I visit is at least a couple machines are off on turning and you can see it decrease the hatch by 3 or 4%.
Yeah, it does definitely change our airflow patterns as well.
Yes.
With your target, with your hatch window, say you've got a normal hatch window would say 24, 26 hours. So again, kind of summarizing, what percent of hatch are you looking for at 24 hours pre-pull and 12 hours pre-pull?
So at 24 hours, you want, you want no more than 10% out at 24 hours. But if you have a 24-hour hatch window, that one may be a better question for you. Because I think I said 84% at 12 hours prior to pull, but I think the Jamesway recommends 60%. And that's just depends on
machine,
how
whether
tough.
it's multi-stage or single stage, it depends.
Yeah.
Whether they want that. So I'm not sure whether you use that there, but okay, so somebody asks a question, you can summarize it, your thoughts on using Spideys if we've got long-term egg storage, and we don't need to go into the details of it, but what are your thoughts on that?
It can really help bring the chick uniformity together because Spidey's replicates the hen coming back to her nest every day, coming back, sitting on the eggs from the day before, warming them up, and then getting back off again. So it really helps those long-term stored eggs be up and ready to perform, like ready to grow once they start incubation temperature, once they hit incubation temperature.
Okay, this is a interesting thought. So if somebody's got multiple eggs from multiple flocks of multiple ages in the machines, would it be possible to try and get a uniform hatch by lowering the temperature in the hatcher to try and slow everything down to get them all to hatch within a proper window?
And that's correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what the hatch sense does. Once it
Yes.
realizes that the chicks
Yeah.
start hatching, they cool down and they sort of delay the rest of them until they're ready to really push them all out at one time.
So without the hatch sense, I mean, could they do that?
Yes, it would take a lot of someone sitting at the computer realizing when the humidity starts going up. If you have very consistent, it always goes up at this time. You could probably set a profile for it. It would make me a little nervous to just set a profile to do that, but I think it's possible.
I think with our hatch window, I know we have some customers that use the hatch window to monitor that timing of when they're hatching, and then they create profiles that will match what HatchSense was trying to do.
Yeah.
So doing it without that, just kind of poking around and trying would be a little bit difficult, but I think it can be done properly. What about weight loss? What are your thoughts on proper weight loss of the eggs? I know we at Jamesway have an idea of, okay, so different machines, different percentages. What is your thoughts on that?
So most of the time I tell people to aim for around 11.5%. And the movie The Patriot, aim small, miss small. The tighter you aim, the less variation you're gonna have. If you allow, I think in multi-stage it's a little bit less, isn't it? Or do I have it
Single
backwards?
stages, the Jamesway single stage, it's a little bit less.
A little bit less, okay.
Because it's a narrower hatch window, essentially. So we've got chicks in more uniform stage, and so we can go a little bit less than that. But I think most people, like you said, at 11.5 is standard.
It's
one
about
of those
standard.
things you don't want to target anything more unless you know you've got uniformity of your hatch. If you don't have uniformity of hatch and you target low, then you run into potential for more problems, I think.
Yeah.
What about your transfer time? What are your thoughts on different transfer times, like in incubation hours? There's different reasons people do different things, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So I always tell people to aim for around 18.5, but I also like to break out a couple of the eggs to see where the chicks are in development. If that yolk is too large or too small, they may need to adjust that. I know some people, they like to transfer early to get that position 6 out a little sooner because they're quite warm. I recommend 18.5.
And a lot of that goes along with, I know if you're using in ovo vaccination, they want certain takes too. But I've been in hatcheries where they have a big hatch window and you can't pick a right number. You're always having some too big or too small. But about that 18.5, what if people are doing like a 19-day transfer? I know we've got some customers that do some at 18 days, some at 19 days. What are your thoughts on that?
As long as you're not if it's multi-stage, as long as you're not too hot in your setters, I think it's fine. You do want to make sure, like you said, if you're doing a novo vaccination, that the embryo's in the right position. And you don't have anything pipping out. I've seen some hatcheries, they have to move theirs up because of that large hatch window. And they actually have chicks pipping and hatching out at transfer. So they've moved it up to 18 days, 10 hours, 18 days, 8 hours. Not ideal. Their incubation settings were wrong for them to be pipping out that early.
Yeah. And I've been in some where they're pipping out quite aggressively at transfer and at vaccination. It makes it difficult. What's the turn angle that you recommend? I know that it's kind of changed over the years, I think, of what recommendations are.
Minimum of 38. We recommend 42-ish. 45 is great. The problem with anything over 45 is that depending on your racks, if it's over, you end up crushing and breaking some of your eggs. If it's really high, you could throw them off the rack, depending on how your turning is. If it's too harsh and they end up throwing eggs off, not ideal. You really want a nice, gentle turn, but yeah, minimum of 38.
Yeah. And that is different than what it used to be. I know years ago it was like 45, 45, 45. And, now it's like, I know you and the other genetic companies are all down. Some of the other done 38s minimum, 40, 41. We actually have a 41-degree turn that some people are concerned about. And I go, that turn angle is fine as long as it's over that 38. So yeah,
we see a lot of issues. Yeah, at 36, 34, a lot of issues with your hatch.
Yeah. Um, what do you have a rule of thumb regarding size and separating eggs to go into different incubators? That's a question being asked, and I've seen that too, is that they're you said that some are doing like hallway one of the young prime mold, but I know some that actually weighing a lot of eggs. Is there a difference if you're like putting all your biggest eggs in one and smallest eggs in another? I mean, that's kind of what we do with age, but
Yeah, kind of same thing, like you said, and it's just gonna depend on how your machines are. If they're functioning, if they can keep up with it, if they're monitoring, if you're using like the pilot egg, it can tell if the temperature is too low or too hot, and it can adjust for those large eggs and those large embryos, or the small eggs with the small embryos. I've not seen many hatcheries separate them, but I would like to.
internationally, I've seen it where
Okay.
but they're by weight. They know what the average weight of the egg is on every trolley.
Huh.
And they were asking, should we separate them by weight? And I don't know how much that gives you, but
Yeah,
good.
I'm not sure.
So somebody says they've got multi-stage incubators, and they consistently get some hatching much earlier than the others, and they're all in the multi-stage. I mean, within that multi-stage, they get a section of them, a group of them always hatching earlier. What's your thoughts on that?
It sounds like there could be something wrong with the setters, which I'm not sure if it's out of one machine or if it's all of them. Because if your gaskets or your seals aren't good and your air's bypassing and you create hot spots, you could create a wider hatch window with some only in this section hatching out sooner than others.
Yeah. Basically, it means to me, there's a ventilation issue. You've got some
Yeah.
cool spots and warm spots, and that's a good thing. Like you mentioned, is it just one machine? Is it all your machines all across the board? You're always seeing that. Is it certain parts of the racks? That's the
Yes.
troubleshooting exercise you come in, but it can definitely happen, and we see it a little bit. We see it everywhere, really, depending on how things are managed. So, all right. Well, we have a lot more questions on here, but I think we're going to end time wise. But if you've asked questions and they were not answered yet, then we'll get to them. You know, we'll get to the written questions, and directly to you. So don't worry about that. But a lot of questions here. A lot of questions means it's a good topic. A lot of stuff. So we might share some of these questions with you, Victoria, and let you answer directly and to our customers. So, but thank you all for coming and participating and attending. I think this was a very good presentation. I learned a lot from it, and I think there's some very good information that, I know I'm going to share with our group. So thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us and participating with us. Our next webinar will be November 20th. And hope to see you all at that one. And again, all of our webinars are recorded. Those that are here will get an email afterwards with a link to the recording, so you can watch it later and share it with others that you need. We have a huge bank of these webinars on our website. If you want to look at some back topics and everything, feel free. We've got a lot of good information there. So thank you, Victoria, for coming and joining us today. And thank you all for participating with us, and hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thank you for having me.